Every Canadian knows the name on the cup. Almost no one knows how the man behind it died. Tim Horton won 4 Stanley Cups across 24 seasons. He was 44, drunk, doing 100 on the QEW at 4 in the morning. They called it a tragic accident. The people who saw him leave that night let him go. Any rink in the National Hockey League. He played defense for the Toronto Maple Leafs through an era when that position meant absorbing contact that would end most careers early. And he did it with a physicality that had nothing to do with violence. He was just absurdly strong. And the players who tried to get past him kept describing the experience the same way.
When he pinned you up against the boards, you were only leaving when Tim gave you permission to leave.
Gordie Howe, who was not exactly a small or gentle man, called Horton the strongest player in hockey. Marcel Provenot, a Hall of Fame defenseman who played against him and later beside him, called him the anchor of Toronto's defense. He won 4 Stanley Cups with the Leafs in 1962, 1963, 1964, and again in 1967, and was named to the NHL postseason All-Star team 6 times across a career that stretched from the early 1950s into the mid-1970s. Between February 1961 and February 1968, he played 486 consecutive regular season games, which remained the Leafs franchise record for decades and held up as the NHL record for consecutive games by a defenseman until 2007. He did all of it with eyesight so poor he needed thick glasses off the ice, which only makes the rest of his career more remarkable. But away from the rink, Horton was struggling with things the fans never saw and the league never addressed. His marriage to Lori was under real strain. Ron Joyce, who would eventually become his business partner and the man who turned 40 donut shops into a national empire, later described a household defined by turbulence, drinking, and long absences. People close to Horton knew he had a serious relationship with alcohol, and it had been going on for years. Not as a secret exactly, but as one of those open facts that everyone acknowledged without anyone doing much about it. The donut chain was never meant to be a side project. Horton opened the first Tim Horton donut shop in Hamilton, Ontario in 1964, and by the early 1970s, the business had grown into roughly 40 locations, making it the 3rd largest donut chain in Canada. That sounds like a comfortable position, and in many ways it was, but it hadn't yet become the kind of income that could replace what the NHL was paying him. His salary with the Buffalo Sabres for the 1973-74 season was $150,000, which in that era was an enormous sum, close to $1 million in today's money. On top of that, the Sabres general manager, Punch Imlach, had sweetened the deal with a De Tomaso Pantera sports car as a signing bonus. Because Imlach knew 2 things about Tim Horton. He loved fast cars, and he could still be talked into 1 more year if the offer was right. Imlach had coached and managed Horton during the Leafs dynasty years in the 1960s. He knew the man, knew his weaknesses, and knew exactly what levers to pull. The Pantera was the lever. Horton had told the sports writer Dick Beddos the previous summer that he was done, that he wanted to spend his winters learning to ski and snowmobile. He came back anyway because Imlach made it easy to come back, and because a young Buffalo team that had just made the playoffs for the first time in franchise history still needed a veteran presence on the blue line. The car that would kill him 4 months later was part of the deal that kept him on the ice. What the Sabres knew about his condition, and what they chose to do with that knowledge, is where this story turns. On February 20th, 1974, the Buffalo Sabres traveled to Toronto to play the Maple Leafs at Maple Leaf Gardens. Horton drove himself in the Pantera rather than riding the team bus, which was not unusual. He made the 100-mile round trip between Toronto and Buffalo regularly in that car, often at speeds that worried the people around him. The day before the game, during practice, a deflected slap shot caught Horton in the jaw and broke it. He played anyway. He was 44 years old, hurting badly enough that he couldn't manage a full shift in the later periods, and the Sabres lost 4-2. Even so, the Gardens crowd and the officials recognized what he had given the game that night, and he was named the 3rd star. It was the last meaningful honor anyone would give him while he was still alive. After the final buzzer, the team dressed, packed up, and headed for the bus. Imlach and Horton walked together on Church Street outside the arena and had what Imlach would later describe as their last conversation. Horton was down, feeling he had cost the team the game by not being able to finish his shifts. Imlach got on the bus. Horton got into the Pantera. Imlach had given him permission to drive himself so he could stop and get medication for the jaw, and that was the last time the general manager saw him. Equipment manager Rip Simonik was one of the last members of the Sabres organization to see Horton that night. As the team filed out through the garage doors at Maple Leaf Gardens, Simonik spotted him walking out with his wife Lori and some old friends from his Leafs days. Simonik said goodbye. He didn't realize it would be the last one, but Horton didn't drive to Buffalo. He drove to Oakville, about 23 miles southwest of Toronto, to the Tim Donut Company where his business partner Ron Joyce was waiting. Joyce would later describe the scene in precise detail. Horton sitting in the dark office with his coat still on, an ice pack wrapped around his jaw, his driver's gloves already on, a vodka and a soda in his hands, and his feet up on the table. That image tells you everything about the man who was about to drive 70 miles through the night. Stop here for a second, because this is the part of the story where every person around Tim Horton had one last chance to change what happened. Around 3 a.m., Horton called his wife and then his brother Jerry. Jerry immediately recognized that Tim had been drinking and tried to talk him into staying put for the night. Tim didn't listen. Joyce later said he watched Horton take a handful of painkillers before walking out to the Pantera and tearing off into the dark. Nobody said the one sentence that might have changed everything, which was, "You are not driving tonight." A little after 4 a.m., a female motorist near Burlington called the Ontario Provincial Police to report a sports car driving at a dangerous speed on the QEW. OPP Constable Mike Gula, stationed near St. Catharines, spotted the Pantera and activated his siren. He never got too close. "I was doing over 100, but I lost sight," Gula told the media afterward. "I never got close." A few minutes later, I came to the accident scene. Near the Lake Street exit in St. Catharines, Horton's Pantera hit a recessed sewer grate at a speed later estimated at over 160 kilometers per hour. The car spun sideways, slammed into a concrete drainage culvert, flipped several times, and came to a rest on its roof in the opposite lanes. Horton was not wearing a seatbelt. He was thrown from the vehicle and found more than 100 feet from the wreckage. Police who arrived at the scene found 6 8-track cassettes, a package of old port cigars, a black suitcase with Tim Horton tooled into the leather, 2 Buffalo Sabres paychecks totaling $1,792, and a broken bottle of Smirnoff vodka. He was pronounced dead at St. Catharines General Hospital. He was 44 years old. The hospital told the press there were no contributing factors. No inquest was ordered, and there were no public investigations. For 31 years, the official story of Tim Horton's death was that a hockey player had driven too fast and lost control of his car, and that was the end of it. Then, in 2005, Ottawa citizen reporter Glenn McGregor used a loophole in Ontario's Freedom of Information law, the provision that lifts privacy protections 30 years after a person's death, and obtained the autopsy. Horton's blood alcohol level was 0.17, more than twice the legal limit of 0.08. The report also found dexedrine, a stimulant, and amobarbitol, a barbiturate component of Dexamyl. No painkillers were detected in his system despite the broken jaw. The full picture of that night had been sitting in an Ontario archive the entire time. The 1970s NHL had no framework for what we now call the duty of care. There was no protocol for evaluating whether a player was fit to drive after a game, and no obligation for a team to manage what happened to its athletes once they left the building. If a man could skate, he played. What happened to him between games was his own problem, and the league saw no reason to change. Punch Imlach knew Tim Horton as well as anyone in the sport. He had managed him through the greatest years of both of their careers in Toronto, had watched him age, had watched the body break down, and had still gone out of his way to bring him back for one more season in Buffalo. He walked with Horton after the final game and saw a man who was in pain, who was emotionally low, and who was about to get behind the wheel of a high-performance machine for a long drive in the middle of the night. And then he got on the bus. Horton told people around him that he felt obligated to keep playing because the team needed him, and nobody in the organization ever gave him a reason to think otherwise. Imlach did not force Horton to drive. He gave him permission to drive, which is a different thing, but the result was the same. The organization's most valuable veteran, a 44-year-old man with a freshly broken jaw and a well-known habit of driving fast and drinking hard, was allowed to leave alone without anyone confirming he was safe to do so. Ron Joyce saw him drinking. His brother Jerry heard it in his voice on the phone and begged him to stay. And nobody took the keys. The drugs in his system tell their own story about the era. Dexamyl was a widely prescribed pharmaceutical in the 1960s and 1970s, a combination of dextroamphetamine and amobarbitol designed to keep you sharp while keeping you calm, and it was common across professional sports. Players used it to manage pain, fatigue, and the accumulated damage of long seasons. The fact that it showed up in Horton's blood was not unusual at the time. What was unusual was that nobody in the decades after his death thought to ask the obvious follow-up questions. Who around him knew the full scope of his condition that night? And why did every single one of them let him leave? That is the story of the accident narrative buried for half a century. When you frame a death as an accident, you center the car and the road and the speed, and you let the people in the institutions around the dead man walk away without ever having to answer for their part in it. When you frame it as a failure of care, the questions land differently. Not just why was he driving that fast, but why was he driving at all? Not just what went wrong on the road, but what went wrong in the arena, in the office in Oakville, on the other end of that phone call his brother made at 3 a.m. The company that carries Tim Horton's name operates nearly 6,000 locations across 13 countries and sits at the center of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. The man who gave it that name died with 2 Sabres paychecks in his pocket and a broken bottle of vodka on the highway beside him. Ron Joyce bought Lori Horton's share of the business for $1 million in 1975. She later challenged the deal in court, arguing she had been too impaired by her own struggles with addiction to have made an informed decision, and she lost. Joyce built the chain into a national institution. Lori burned through her entire fortune in less than a decade. There was no public reckoning with the question of whether the organization bore any share of the blame. No lawsuit, no inquiry, no admission of fault. The Sabres retired his number, named him a legend, and never had to answer for the night they let a 44-year-old man with a broken jaw drive alone into the dark in a car they had given him. The patterns surrounding Tim Horton's death have recurred across the decades since. An aging player kept on the ice by a salary he couldn't refuse, and a car he couldn't resist, past the point his body could handle. Substance use that the people closest to him were aware of and did not meaningfully address. No institutional mechanism for intervening when a player's off-ice behavior puts his life at risk. These are the same dynamics that surfaced in the opioid lawsuits, the CTE revelations, and the death of Derek Boogaard. The NHL has been confronting the same structural failure for 50 years now, and it keeps arriving at the same place, which is nowhere. The next time you pull into a drive-thru and see that name on the cup, remember that the name was a man. A man who played through a broken jaw, sat in a dark office with a drink in his hand, ignoring his brother's warning, and drove into the night because nobody around him did the one thing that might have saved his life, which was simply to say no. That is the story the brand will never tell you, because the brand was built on top of the silence that followed. The autopsy sat in an Ontario government archive for 31 years before a single journalist thought to request it. Every answer was already there, sealed in a file, waiting for someone to care enough to pull it. The question was never whether the truth existed. The question was whether anyone believed it mattered more than the story everyone had already agreed to tell. If this is the kind of work you want to keep seeing, joining Healthy Scratch is the most direct way to make that happen. You get priority replies, loyalty badges, exclusive emojis, early access to videos, and you become part of the reason stories like this one keep getting made. The link is below. And if you're not ready for that yet, just subscribe because next time we're going somewhere the league would rather you didn't look.